Leng, before we start, would you perhaps just share a little bit about you and your background and your area of expertise in the area of diversity and inclusion?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for the warm welcome. It's absolutely great to be here again, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation too. In terms of my experience, I've worked across a lot of different sectors over the last few years. So I've been in sort of the third sector, I've been in retail, I've been in real estate, I've been in professional services. I've also consulted freelance across media and finance as well. So I feel that with diversity and inclusion, I've seen organisations at various different stages of their sort of journeys, and for me personally, I've just been very passionate about it from a young age. And it was more at university I realised that I didn't realise D&I was really a career option for people, but I studied photojournalism, and all of my projects, not products, were literally all based around sort of communities and people having their own voice and representing themselves and looking for inequality and lack of representation and how that tallied up. So when I realised that diversity and inclusion was a viable job option, that was really that I thought this is what I want to do. So for the past sort of 7 years, I've really been quite solidly in here. And what I've learned from it overall is that it's a job that's never just job done. It's something that you have to learn how to spin a lot of plates. You learn a lot about internal politics. You also learn about global and external politics as well. But overall, it's always about it's about representing people in a better way. And I feel that that does make the place of work better, and by extension of that, society a better place. So this is why I love what I do, and I'll never give it up.
And I think that, Leng, I definitely echo a lot of the things that you've said there, and I think it becomes an extension of the conversations that we have every day in our daily lives. I definitely know that for me, I have as many conversations around diversity, inclusion, equality with my friends and my family as I do in a corporate setting. My first question for you, Leng, when thinking about equality, what, in your view, have been the really major turning points in history that have helped move us to where we are today? Wow,
that's a great one, actually. I suddenly thought, am I in an interview? And I realise I've looked like I'm dressed for one today, but I'm not. I can assure you of that. I think, actually, some of the biggest turning points, if we think about it, actually have been rooted in protest. So if we think about, if we think about suffragettes, and we think about, obviously, sort of women getting the vote, for example, or how that's also expanded in different situations, that's been really, really critical in terms of how we've gone forward. I also think of late, obviously, it would be a complete remiss to completely ignore the fact that we've had Black Lives Matter sort of global sort of gatherings happening, or sort of different representations of that happening all over the world. And I think this is really critical right now. And also, when we look back at civil rights, when we look at LGBT rights, that started off as a form of protest. And that's something that I think we really, really need to look at and really embrace, because I think if we hear the word activist, or if we hear the word protest, we get a bit worried. And particularly in corporate settings, we're a bit like, oh no, it's this sort of deviancy. But actually, if we think about it, the equalities and the rights that we have today were born out of people protesting. And in fact, the reason why we're not having to pay poll tax, even in the UK at the moment, was because people went and protested when the government tried to propose that. So I do feel that a lot of equality that's fought for, it literally has been fought for. And it's actually been about people actually displaying ally type behaviour, because it isn't just one minority group in that situation, it's a lot of people joining together to support that. And it's about us holding a mirror up and looking at things. So, but particularly with Black Lives Matters, what it's brought up for me, particularly at the moment, of this last year in particular, has been us looking collectively at white privilege and actually looking at the racial inequality. And actually, the question that I found myself asking myself numerous times is, why is talking about race such an awkward conversation in the first place? I mean, I say this because I sometimes feel awkward, but for quite, I'd say, a unique reason, and that is I am actually mixed race, but I don't look anything like my ethnic background at all. So my father had mixed heritage, which was definitely between Asian and Afro-Caribbean, and I've come out looking Italian. So, sort of, I could control maybe how my gender transition went, and I could change just that, but I cannot change my skin colour. So, you know, but for all intents and purposes, I look white, I sound white, I will be viewed as a white person, and therefore I've definitely benefited from white privilege in my life. I've never had any discrimination based on my skin colour. And I think maybe for some reason that perhaps because people haven't experienced anything negative based on that, that makes it difficult for them. But it doesn't mean we should shy away from this, because this is a massive inequality that we're facing. And actually what it's brought up to me is it's made me realise, particularly in diversity and inclusion space, that more of us have to get comfortable with even having these conversations, but also just making sure that we are including everyone. Because I think if we work at firms where we talk about people being themselves, or we want people to bring their whole selves to work, well, in those instances, then those are really important statements that we hold true to ourselves and for our employees at all times. And also thinking about the wider picture as well. I'm a firm believer that an organisation should be truly representative of the society that it's placed in. So obviously if there isn't that in there, then we need to sort of address this quite solidly. Otherwise, we're all at risk, really, of just sounding like we're making a soundbite, or we're just trying to tick a box, or we just made a little buzzword and a buzz statement. And in a lot of cases, that really isn't the intention behind that. So that's where I feel we're at with that.
And I definitely agree that there was something, as you were talking there, Leng, that I think is really interesting, particularly about the point around activists and protests, and a lot of the media, and there's been a lot of backlash around Black Lives Matter and anger around these protests, which I personally can't understand. And I think it relates also to the point you made there around white privilege and people having difficult conversations. And the reason that people often don't have difficult conversations is that it makes us feel uncomfortable. And when people feel uncomfortable and people feel that they don't have the answers and they don't know what they need to say, they often then shy away from having those conversations. And I think that also relates a lot to kind of the view around protesters and activists. We're having these protests because there is something that isn't right in the system at the moment. One of the things I often think about in terms of, I often see that the protest is the tipping point of change starting to happen, but it's often not the solution. It often doesn't form the solution. Other things in the corporate space, in wider community space, have to help with us getting to solutions. If you think about where we are today, and that's really what we're wanting to focus on, where we are now, is there anything that you think has actually meant that we've moved backwards?
Yes, I would say there has been some movement backwards. I mean, one thing that's been very interesting, I think, is how people respond to equality and diversity and equity, actually, and inclusion as a whole, because the amount of belly aching I hear sometimes when, and people, I've been called before. I was at a social, in the days when we could socialise before COVID sort of popped in as well and just caused the havoc it has. I remember I was at a social gathering and someone said, when I described what I did for a job, it was like, oh, are you the woke police? And I was like, what does that mean? And I noticed there was, oh, can I say that in front of you? Because, that means that this doesn't sound very politically correct. And it's like, and it's just this kind of suspicion around, sort of giving rights. And I think that when it comes to inclusion in particular, I mean, I just wish people would think in terms of the Great British Bake Off and a showstopper. And the reason why I'm using that metaphor and that analogy right now is the fact that when you try and make things more equal, or you try and include more people, you're not cutting away slices of cake or pie. You're not taking things away. In fact, you're adding, if anything. And I just think, well, why would you give the most basic looking, tired looking, sort of very unattractive Victoria sponge and give, and when you could actually add more things to it, you could be adding some sugar art, you could be adding all sorts of things. If you think about making something look really impressive, or elevating what perhaps would be a, Victoria sponge to a 3-tiered lovely wedding cake. If you think about that, that's far more beautiful and attractive to go. That's all we're trying to do. But the problem is, I think that where there is always a situation of, well, what about this group of people? Or people think that by creating equality, it creates more of a currency of inequality in certain situations. So people think things are being taken away, and then they become a bit resistant to that. And what I've noticed is a big uptake in terms of the way that people are maybe feeling that maybe some of their views are being challenged, so they may not voice it publicly, but they're showing it in other ways. So I'm seeing that happening at ballot boxes. You know, we have seen what kind of world leadership we have at the moment in lots of other countries, not just our, you know, wherever. And there is a bit more of a sharp increase to the right wing that's increasing. It's worrying me that actually certain right-wing rhetoric is actually sort of really going through the world. And actually in some parts of the world, it's becoming quite unsafe. You know, there are some countries at the moment where it's been declared LGBT-free zones. They've been appearing and things like that. And just you know, certain things that we've seen historically that have happened before, that I can see some of the behaviours creeping back in a little bit. So I feel that people are doing that. And even sometimes in staff engagement surveys in companies I've worked in before, sometimes I've noticed where there's been certain bits of access metadata that we can access, there's been a bit of an increase in terms of how people are. Because I think people are sort of in effect what I'm calling protest voting. So they may not say anything out loud to you per se, but actually there are certain things that are sort of being sort of described or sort of played back a bit, and that does concern me. And I think a lot of it is down to the fact that I think in our intention to be inclusive, one thing that I think would be really important for us to do is explain a bit more why we're doing it, rather than having everything so polarized. Because at the moment, I feel certain areas of conversation are highly polarized. It's either this is good or that is bad, and that's not giving people much to work with. Or if we are using new concepts, new terms of language and stuff, explain that a little bit more, rather than making people feel stupid or not very smart if they don't quite get it straight away. Because I think accessibility is so important as well, and that includes language and way. I mean, I'm someone with dyslexia, so if someone wants to give me really complicated terms, I can understand them verbally, but we all need that explanation. I can't just read a very long passage of stuff, and if things feel like a very dense, heavy academic text, nothing against those at all, but that isn't going to be automatically accessible and applicable to everyone. So if we're to talk about things, I think it's important, and particularly where I think businesses have a good responsibility of this, be very clear with the language about what your values is and how you work. Because if people know what's expected of them or how to work effectively, that's going to help. And actually that positive role modelling means that people often will then role model that at home. They might role model that in more wider society. And that's where I think the workplace can be a really good and successful agent of change.
No, yeah, absolutely. You talked there a bit about making sure things are accessible, and I think that kind of plays to the wider conversation around accessibility and making people feel that they're able to participate in conversations. What you were just talking about there, Leng, really made me actually stop and think, why do you think that this is occurring, Leng, that people are being perhaps silent in a public forum, in a work discussion, but then feeling or voting in a certain way, behaving in a certain way? I think there's lots of examples around social media when people can kind of hide who they are in the way that they might be acting or responding. Why do you think that's happening? Why do you think people aren't able to feel that they're able to express their real opinions and voices?
I think that's a great question again. And, you know, one thing I've noticed that I think the media is really, you know, basically the media is a massive influencer of a lot of how we behave and we think and we feel. And sometimes, you know, sort of, I know from, if I, you know, by putting certain snapshots on things, you know, for example, something that concerns me about minority group representation in the media overall is that a typical tried and tested way of creating a moral panic, and I know this from studying photojournalism at university, if there wants to be a moral panic created, basically a very successful way that the media has done that to manipulate people for years and years and years is just by perhaps questioning the safety of women and children, but then putting a minority group next to them. Because of course that puts you in a really big dilemma. You think, well, of course I stand for women's rights, or of course I want to support, you know, women, you know, children should be protected at all times. But then putting, you know, sort of a minority group next to them and sort of portraying them to be the boogeyman, basically, that's going to be that's a way to guarantee that it's going to make people question, or they're not going to be as objective in their way of questioning maybe the sources of news, or actually, you know, how is that? So I think one way to counter that is, you know, something I advise everyone to do actually, is that by all means, everyone is entitled to their thoughts as well. So that's something that I want to be very clear. And I think we all have to remember that. But if we have certain thoughts and opinions, then we own that and we stand by them. Because, you know, that's really crucial as individuals, that we stand by that. But there's no point saying racist things and saying, I'm not a racist person. You know what I mean? It's like, if you've dropped the N-word, or if you've said various things, or you've supported things that are very clearly not something that's very inclusive to people of colour, well, own it then. You know, in the same way that if you don't like gay people, just say it. Say, I don't like them, but don't try and give a lot of reasons why you don't. But in terms of my wider point, though, it's like, what I feel that's really important, though, within those sorts of conversations, is that if ever you see anything written or spoken about a group of people, particularly if they are a minority group, and actually maybe a group that you don't have any affinity with, it's not the end of the world. And it isn't a bad thing if you're not friends with someone from a certain community per se, you know, because that's not always the case with where you are. But what all I would appeal to people to do, particularly with representation, is maybe try and look for something written about people from that community as well. Because otherwise, if you're just hearing information about a group of people without actually hearing from that group of people themselves, it might not always be a very accurate representation. So, and in the same way that in the type of work that I do, one thing I try and do when I'm putting strategies together or any further wider areas of work in the workplace is basically, I have a policy in my own mind that's a bit of a mantra, which is, I will not do anything about people without those people involved, or so. Nothing about them without them, basically, is just how it's sort of is the way I like to work. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because, for example, it would be really outrageous as me to decide what, you know, a strategy for gender, or particularly for women's issues in the workplace, should be when I'm a man, you know, without having spoken to a single woman. So you see what I mean? It's like, it's bringing those things into it and then moving it forward.
No, absolutely. And I think the point around accountability and owning mistakes that have been made, I think particularly with everything around Black Lives Matter and the responses from individuals as well as organisations, those organisations that I think that have done very well are the ones that have owned up to mistakes that they've made in the past and have been very honest about those and recognised that they need to do things differently. I think where organisations have really had a negative, you know, impact, negative PR around a lot of this is where they've made commitment statements, and then employees in those organisations have put their hands up and said, this isn't the experience that we actually have in this organisation. What you've written isn't representative of actually what happens. And so that point that you made there, Leng, around owning and taking accountability, is people are much more forgiving if you're able to recognise the mistakes that you've made, either at a corporate level or at an individual level. And it leads me on to my next question. Is there either a particular individual, Leng, or some individuals, or an organisation that you think is really leading the way when we really think about equality and equity?
I think there's quite a number actually that spring to mind, because I've been, particularly since joining the diversity and inclusion community a few years ago, the first thing what I loved most about this is sometimes when you see people that are your peers or whatever, in certain types of sector or certain types of job, it can become very competitive. Whereas with diversity and inclusion, the whole nature is about, it's so different because it's about collaboration and actually how do we drive the best results, but also how will we all collectively brainstorm and do that. So it's been so nice to feel that you've got cheerleaders around you in effect and you cheerlead each other. And there are numerous people I've met in my career that that I've also worked with. But I think in terms of particular standout individuals, Pamela Hutchinson of Bloomberg, she's actually someone that I massively look up to. My first ever corporate panel that I ever did, she was sat on, and I was just amazed at the gravitas and also just how she structures out teams, but her view and idea of, you know, sort of how things should be structured out there, it's a bit more bold and it's a bit more impactful. And also it's the fact that I just find that she's one of the most authentic leaders I've ever met. Her commitment towards people's development and mentoring, I think, has always been really, really good. But another person that I've also met in my career that absolutely just, you know, I often make this joke and I say, if you are going to have a white man called John in your organisation, you need a John Elliott, and that's John Elliott of Sainsbury's, because he, again, is one of the most inclusive leaders that I've ever met. And the way that he interacts with colleagues, and also the fact that he's a very visible role model, but also he's a massive ally to so many different groups, and he makes that very clear. And he's very unapologetic about it either. He'll just, you know, I've never seen anyone that will actually clear a lot of their own time, even personal time, to really show commitment to teams and also people that they work around. So those people in particular in my career have really, really inspired me. And another thing I've really liked about their leadership styles is both of them, I'd say, they're highly senior in their roles. You know, they definitely have the right gravitas and authority, but they're also kind. And I think that that's sort of, you know, those sorts of qualities are really important. And I think they're undervalued sometimes, but I value those very highly.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And that point around kindness, I think, is not discussed enough in management and leadership theory, and I think that there's some, you know, more interesting research happening now around actually the importance of kindness and what that brings. And I think that point on having a person called John really championing the diversity and inclusion agenda, I've seen that in a number of other organisations where that's worked, and it's really important. And I think, again, it's around not having a breadth of perspectives when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, and I think that's really critical. What, Leng, thinking kind of from your perspective and your experience of working in this area, and if we are to make progress that we want to around the area of equality, and specifically around the area of gender equality and intersectionality, you and I spoke previously around this, that whilst we might have made some, not complete, but some progress in the area of gender equality for white women, there is less progress if we think around other aspects of diversity. So those from the LGBT community, those women with disabilities, those non-white women, and I think that there are lots of challenges that we really need to solve if we're ever going to think and create in the corporate space an area around gender equality that's focused on all aspects. But what do you think is the biggest challenge that we need to overcome in the corporate space in the short term?
Again, I'm loving these questions, actually. I think one of the biggest things in the short term is we have to stop having the pause or the but. You know, so the sort of the excuse for why we're not going to be as inclusive or be as bold or be as brave as we should be, really, because I hear it in so many different parts of conversations, and I've heard it so many times in my career, such as, you know, why should there even be, you know, for example, why should there be anxiety if you were going to hire someone that's a senior director if they happen to be transgender? Why should that even be a thing? Mm-hmm. You know, why should there be a sort of question about, about us having a female CEO, or even thinking about someone with a disability? Why is that going to be a problem? And given that we all talk about wanting to have better flexibility and stuff, why is it an issue if someone actually spends most of their time working at home, if they're producing well and also they can even manage well remotely? Because actually, you know, sometimes it's not about us all being present in a room all the time, in the same physical room anyway. And I just think that there are just so many areas that I think we overlook talent all the time. You know, sort of if we look at what's happened with people with disabilities, the fact there's always that pause or just the sort of implication of, will they be able to manage? You know, when in fact lots of people can manage. Let's have that conversation. But I think we have to get far more confident about that. And also, in situations where you're a business where you're client facing and stuff, you should never be bringing it into question, really, the colour of someone's skin, how they look, or who they are. because otherwise, I'm sorry, but that is discrimination going on there. You can make as many fancy words for it as much as you like, and also just get more confident and be a bit more braver to ask questions. So if you see a CV coming through and you can't pronounce the name, for example, you know, ask the person what their name is, rather than just you feel embarrassed and thinking someone else will feel embarrassed and awkward. So then you toss that to one side, because I think that actually turning down talent like that is absolutely atrocious. But also, that's not going to be, you're not going to get a truly representative company. I also think other things that companies can be doing to hold themselves to account more is really think about your supply chain. You know, because obviously it's not, there's so much you can do under one roof, but obviously the larger you get as a company, you have different stakeholders as well. And how are you holding them to account? How well versed in your values do they actually know that they are? And by that, I mean, so obviously talking to your recruitment people, looking at data. Data is crucial right now. So, you know, at least have an idea of where things are at. And also, if you have got bad data, embrace it. In fact, celebrate it. I love it when I get bad data sometimes, and I'll tell you why, which probably would shock. So I do work in an accountancy firm at the moment, and if anyone's watching right now, they're probably sort of looking at me like, what is he coming out with? But bear with me here, people. Sometimes bad data means that we actually know what the actual root cause of the problem is. If we're trying to basically just put the best spin on things all the time, well, not everything is a PR exercise. And in fact, if we know that there's a really deep societal issue, particularly for certain minority groups, for example, with representation, well, it's not going to be, to me, I think it's not really a big surprise if then your data at work looks bad. In fact, it's actually being representative of society. And that way, it's giving you a bit more of an indication as an organisation of where you can map and trace yourself. Also, you can think, okay, how are we going to make a difference? Because as we know, I feel that in a very competitive market and everything, why are people giving up their opportunity to lead? And in order to lead effectively, you need to know how bad things are, because then you know how to make the right sort of interventions. But also, rather than wait for some magical best practice to appear somewhere, because that isn't the case. You know, I haven't seen a unicorn this year yet. I'd love to, but you know, you don't see those. So in these situations, think about how you are going to actually make some best practice for yourself and make sure it's fit for purpose for your people, for your company, and for all of your stakeholders, because that's how you can start leading more. And as we know, the most innovative companies that actually have been more profitable and more productive have tended to be more inclusive, and they made a more bolder statement first rather than just waiting around for things. So if anything, get to the real root cause of everything that's in place and then go forward from there, because it does work, but it just involves a bit of a leap of faith and actually just bearing in mind that we're not always going to get good messages all the time. And actually, that's not always the end of the world. We actually have to think more about actually how we know exactly where we're at as a company so that we can actually make the right decisions. Because by having exercises and collecting more data and all of that kind of stuff, that doesn't really cost a lot of money. So rather than putting in interventions that do cost a lot of money straight away, actually get to the root of things, do a little bit of work on that side, then you're going to know how to invest effectively.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point there. I think so often we think we have to know the answer and come up with a solution before we've really understood what the problem is. And I think it's exactly what you're saying there, Leng. You need to understand the root causes. How do you do that? What advice could you give to those in the audience of how you effectively do that? Because what I often see organisations do, Leng, is they're very good at reporting on their representation data, so demographics across different areas, but don't spend as much time, in my view, of really understanding the experiences. And there was something that you said again that really pricked my interest about so often, and we do this as human beings, we make judgments and we think that we know. Your point around someone being in a senior leadership role that might have a disability, of the barriers of that, why they might not be doing that, rather than having a conversation to think about what might need to change in a corporation. And we see it so often, not just in this area, where human beings and we do so often make judgments and think we know how someone's going to answer something, how someone's going to feel about something. So how do we really get to the root cause of some of these issues, some of the reasons the representation data is as it stands?
I think it's also looking at all areas of the employee life cycle and getting all over that, because I feel that a lot of organisations now, they're definitely starting to look at their talent pipelines a bit more, because interesting, what I feel often comes out when we have conversations about black pay gaps, ethnicity pay gaps, gender pay gaps, for example, initially it's the biggest headline is not necessarily the actual pay gap itself. It's usually, I find, well, obviously that does come in, especially if it's not a very good one, but again, on that, related to that, have a much clearer process and discussion around bonuses, because that's the most opaque area that I've ever seen in a lot of organizations, that, you know, there's never really much clarity as to basically, oh, well, I like you, so we'll give you a bit more sort of attitude, which kind of seems to be the headline message that comes out. But I think it's really important that within that area, though, representation is the area that tends to come out a lot more. But I also think one area that just doesn't seem to get the right attention in a lot of organisations is actually talent mapping and actually talent pools, because I feel that a lot more organisations have tightened up their recruitment processes to kind of eliminate unconscious bias. There's special software that some people use where, you know, that has more inclusive language that's going to attract people more. Also, measure the attraction, because also, how do you know if these interventions have worked very well if you don't know much from the demographic of people applying? So where possible, if you can capture some confidential diversity information about candidates, that's going to be really helpful to you, because otherwise, how are you going to know if that's working or not? And also, if there is a problem with your hiring process, that will actually help you identify that a little bit more. So always track at every point of what you're doing through someone's onboarding and life cycle, because that's crucial. But to what I was saying about talent pools, I still find that area, and also around promotions and things like that, I find that whole area is really, really vague a lot of the time. I mean, there's some companies that have a scoring system, some people have appraisals, or you get ratings. Some have this 9-box grid, which sounds really mythical and amazing. Or I just keep thinking they're playing bingo with people's careers, really. But, you know, because in most cases, you know, where if there is that grid system in place, my question to a lot of companies would be, well, okay, so are you open with colleagues about where they're at? You know, because if in some situations, I know that I'd be curious to know, well, okay, so if there is this 9-box grid or whatever grid you've got, where am I then? And why is there a big mystery and a big question mark around that? Because the problem is that's another area where I feel you can get a lot of bias, because, you know, and also I think the other area that needs a lot of significant support in all organisations is actually middle management and people with any line management or people management responsibilities, partly because you can get some fantastic and inspirational line managers, but what if you end up with one that maybe feels threatened by you? You can get hampered by people like that quite easily. And interestingly enough, underrepresented groups tend to get hampered and held down a lot more. So again, I think it's really, really important that we look at those aspects a bit more, because I feel that that whole area of talent development, promotion, etc., unless there's companies that really invest in that quite heavily, or where that's a sort of where development and that area of mentoring and sponsorship and all those things are a very fluid conversation. If people are not so aware, you can end up with a bit of a situation where it's luck of the draw as to who manages you, and do you have a manager that wants you to succeed and maybe sees you having their job one day because they feel that comfortable or they're that much of an inclusive leader, or have you got someone that's threatened by you? Because I find that in those situations, that's going to hold a lot of people back. And the really disappointing thing is that organisations lose talent that way. But also another thing that happens is that the potential for some people to be leaders one day, or to really fulfil their full potential in their life cycle, will not be seen out, not in that company, or not even at all. And that, I think, from a wider aspect, is a real shame. So I think that, you know, we shouldn't be inhibiting people in that way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there are definitely as you mentioned, there are lots of things that are built in for the talent acquisition part of the process that has focused a lot on trying to eliminate bias. We obviously know we can't mitigate it entirely, but we can do things to try and reduce it as much. It's very interesting. I'm very passionate about the topic of talent management and, you know, performance appraisals and very traditional approaches to performance appraisals, which often we think if we give something a number, then gives it more rigor, and actually it still has exactly the same bias. So I think organisations that are much better around managing their talent, where they're having very regular conversations, to your point, all around transparency. As soon as you have an organisation where if you walked into any office and everyone knew how they are doing on any given day, that's a very transparent way of managing performance, and then you're trying to eliminate bias. I mean, it's a very long conversation, I don't want to digress too much, but I do definitely agree that I think that there is it's about thinking through the whole process of when an employee is in a business and how you try and mitigate those biases, and how you try to ensure that it's as inclusive as possible to every person in that organisation. And it's a hard thing to do, and I think that's the other thing. You, as an organisation, you have to understand that this is difficult, to be able to really hear the voices of employees whilst managing your P&L, whilst managing your pipeline, whilst managing your customers. It is a hard thing to do, but when you then connect it to your sales pipeline, when you connect it to your productivity, that's when actually it feels as though there is a real benefit for you doing this as well, and making the connections across those different areas. Thinking about D&I from a global perspective, Leng, what's your view in terms of the impact that it's had, and how organisations can look at D&I from a global perspective, because we know the laws are very different in each jurisdiction. So if someone is trying to look at the topic around gender equality, and if we take specifically just the area around the LGBT community, we know that we've got very different legislation in each country. How can you approach that in a really effective way?
Well, I think that is a great question, and it's funny, it's very topical, because there was something in the news this weekend about diversity and things like that coming through from a certain American world leader, who I don't think we need to say his name, which again, when I saw the headline, I mean, I did actually laugh out loud, because I thought, well, obviously some of us are doing our job a little bit too well, and so keep going. Actually, it's my sort of attitude and way with that, because if it means that we are actually asking questions, and we are trying to include more people in situations, and actually, in effect, making people that are quite bigoted feel like they're losing their majority status, then let's keep going with that, and let's keep that way going, because that is actually a correct way of being. But to your point, though, it can be quite difficult, because obviously across the world, as we know, in over 70 countries now, it's still illegal or still punishable by death in a lot of places to be, or particularly if we take gender identity out, that's if we take trans out, that to be LGB per se, we'll particularly focus on G and L in those situations. But then in some countries, you're not recognised as being trans, so it can be quite variable where you go across the world. Yeah. But obviously there has been a huge upsurge in certain countries at the moment, where definitely there is a larger LGBT rhetoric that's definitely emerging. And I say this because obviously in some countries, the death rates for people that are murdered for being transgender are huge. And a lot of them do sit in certain countries. This year alone, there's been over 330 people murdered for being transgender alone, and we're not hearing about that so much. But one thing I think that companies can do on a global scale, which has been really successful, is to adopt what's known as an embassy system. So obviously it means that wherever you place an office or a physical space, or where you have presence, you have to respect local laws to a big degree. But one thing you can do is, with your company policies, is create a situation where that is actually a safe position for people to be in at work. And also, if you are going to second people or suggest secondments, things that companies should be doing is they should give an area where people don't have to give a reason if they object to certain things, because obviously it might not be safe for them to be in a certain country because of who they are, or if they're type, because people that have equal marriages, well, the fact is that we have to have different names for same-sex marriage anywhere. I find quite insulting, actually, and I find that really wrong. Why can't we just say marriage for everything? But the fact is, there are some countries that don't even recognise that marriage, you know, so that can become an issue as well, or that could impact how someone's available to have a right to work or a visa or all those sorts of things. So I think by adopting an embassy system, that's good, so that people are at least protected by company policy, because those company policies and values can actually help start influencing from within in those societies. Because people think, oh, actually, we celebrate Pride in this company, and actually we've got this really big global LGBT network. Maybe those people aren't so bad after all. And yeah, it's not nice the way I'm putting it across there, but that's how people's thought processes go with that. And actually by having different forms of exposure in a positive way, or actually just working with people and seeing that actually just because someone might be in a same-sex relationship, you know what, everyone still has a coffee or still chats or still gets annoyed with the IT infrastructure of the company like everybody else. It doesn't make you any different because you're gay, you know, so mine. But another thing that private sector companies have been very successful of have been sometimes ones that have gone a bit further, so they've gone to more of an advocate position. So if there have been certain proposed laws that actually would be contravening what they want to do in terms of an inclusive way, they've challenged. So in North Carolina, when a toilet bill was proposed, that was very anti-transgender, there were certain companies, and two of them that I know off the top of my head very quickly, one of them was PayPal, one of them was Deutsche Bank. They put challenges, and they actually refused to put their offices there initially, because that actually contravened, you know, sort of like, and that actually compromised the situation for clients, but also for their colleagues as well. So I think it's really, really good. Salesforce also have been quite vocal as well in terms of what they would and wouldn't do. But actually, I thought I was quite amazed to see that it was actually big companies that were actually standing up to certain areas of legislation, especially when it's something that's a draft proposal that's actually led on hate. And it's actually, there's no need for that. There's no need to be discriminating against a group of people in that way. And I think that's really important that companies get more confident on that, because what I can see happening and what I can already see challenging is there's certain legislations that even are being, just the fact it's being said out loud, that they might rescind laws that mean that you could be, you know, fired just for being gay, for example, or the fact that people can be fired based on their gender or disability status and even ethnic status, lots of different areas there. That really concerns me, because that's just giving a clear open door for discrimination. And that's something that I think we all need to unite and stand against, because the problem is when I think if one of these gets passed, then other groups of people will start getting lumped in as well, because it never just stuff that sort of hate, as we know, it spreads. It's never just one group of people that are going to get it. It will be a lot. So if there's an attack on women's rights, there'll be an attack on LGBT rights as well. So we have to all be vigilant there. And that's why I think we really, really need to make sure that we are as allied and step up as allies to each other as much as possible, because this is something that I could see happening. But the thing that I feel more positive and confident on is that organisations that do have inclusion and really strong diversity values at their core, they will not tolerate those as company policies. So they will keep that really embedded, that we do not do this. So that's a really big hope, but it is a concern of mine as well. And it's something that I would like us all to be very mindful about and to think about sometimes. And this is why it's relevant, and this is why we support each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that point there, that we are all different, but often we all have, you know, similarities. I think it's something that definitely came out from the social experiment we did earlier this year. We, as you say, we all have coffee, we all eat breakfast, we all experience love, we all experience grief, we all experience happiness, we all experience sadness. And I think the focus sometimes on helping us to see each other as humans and our similarities allows us to actually also understand our differences better. And I think often we go into the conversation around diversity and inclusion focusing too much so on our differences between different minority groups from minority and majority groups, rather than trying to understand some of the similarities as well, because I think by doing that, then it makes the conversation around the differences often so much easier. And my last question, Leng, because I'm conscious of time, and I know we've got some questions from people in the audience. I often talk about this, and I know that you do as well, Leng, we so much focus on the responsibility of corporates, the responsibility of leaders, the responsibility of managers, but actually the one thing that we all have the ability to do is take personal responsibility. So if there was a piece of advice that you would give to people that are listening now or listening later, what would be the one thing that each individual could be doing to really make a change in this area?
I think what I've learned, because I've realised we're all so different as well, you know, like not everyone is the most confrontative of people. Some of us are a bit shy, some of us have, and I feel those things actually a lot of the time. And, you know, the amount of times I've had what I call the HR hot potato coming my way because I'm like, oh, no one wants to have that whole conversation. So it's like, oh, great, we've got a diversity person, they'll do it, you know. But the main thing that I've learned in my time is that if anything ever feels a little bit off, try and do something you can to impact that change. So it doesn't mean you have to save things, you don't have to necessarily confront things, or you don't have to always, you know, sort of really get heavily involved, but know that you did something, especially if you meant that you did something that was more inclusive. So it could be a case of making sure if you're in a street environment, you know, if you're in a shop or a restaurant or something, let's say there's someone that's person of colour that someone's being very rude to, it could be they're serving something or they're behind that. And afterwards, just, you know, sort of maybe sometimes ways to sometimes check in that that person's okay, but you could just do a very simple, well, that was very rude, and that, you know, I've had a really nice experience with you. Things like that, you know, that's a way of actually knowing that if you've actually been there, you haven't actually been an active bystander, or if you are more confident to do so, if someone's being rude to someone, correct them, you know, because sometimes I've just said a statement of, I don't think that's very necessary, or is that necessary to talk to someone like that? And that can instantly diffuse things very quickly. In a situation where maybe someone's using misinformation or is using some really bad stereotypes, maybe it's moving into that banter space that actually is a little bit uncomfortable for everyone. But the problem is, if no one says anything, it continues. Just be a bit like, is that really necessary? Or, you know, I've sometimes joked and said, you know, have we gone back to the 1800s today? If I've heard men making comments about women being in kitchens or, you know, things like that. So, you know, I think it's important sometimes to just find what works for you. But I think the main thing is, rather than coming away and feeling bad, because sometimes that guilt and that shame and that badness is because we know we could have done something and we didn't. So think about what we can do to impact change. And also, in the same way that, you know, if any of us are parents, you know, think about what you tell your children. If they start to behave in certain ways, you would probably want to make sure they're on course and they're steered in a really, really good way. So try and do that with other people, but it doesn't mean you necessarily take on a paternal or maternal role. It's just about actually, how am I doing my thing to be a good citizen?
Yes, yeah, and as you say there, like asking a question often then prompts someone to think about what they may have said and the impact of what they've said might have on others. But I think you made an excellent point at the start of what you were saying. I think so often we think that we have to say it in a very confrontational way, or perhaps in a, you know, for many people that are introvert or don't feel comfortable with conflict, you do it in a way that works for you, and in a way where, yes, you're doing something that is potentially brave, but you're I think the importance of what you're saying there, Leng, is that people need to call it out when it happens, because it's like any behaviour, in the moment it has the greatest impact, but it's about calling out the small things that happen continuously rather than waiting for something much larger, which becomes much more difficult to manage.
Yeah. And, you know, just a final example I'll give as well. So if there is anything really extreme that happens, like if, let's say, you witness a hate crime, for example, sometimes that is not a safe time to start confronting because it's unsafe. But at least by making it clear to the person on the receiving end of something, especially if they had to get to a position where they had to call police or something like that, share your information with them and make it be clear you'd be happy to leave a statement of what you saw or heard. You know, it's those little actions like that that will be very helpful. And also ask the person afterwards if they're okay, because, you know, it's sort of, unfortunately, in the last year and a half, there has been quite an increase in hate crime, particularly in the UK. So it's important to bear that in mind, because it's not always safe or comfortable for people to always open their phone and start recording, though more people are doing that, which is very helpful. So if you can gather evidence for someone, do that. But afterwards, at least make it clear how they can contact you, especially if you did need to show support for something like that, because that, again, is an area where you can make action. Doesn't mean you have to directly confront the perpetrator in that way, but you're still doing something.
That's great advice. Thanks, Leng. I can see that we've had a few questions as we've been talking, Leng. I think if I read out a few of them, and then if anyone else has any other questions, please do ask them. So the first one was, how much protests stand on a scale of 1 to 10 when compared with awareness? So I think, protest versus awareness, where would you put those on a scale of 1 to 10 on importance?
Oh, important. I would actually weight them in equal measures, to be entirely honest. So I've both put them at 9 and 10, because the thing is, what I've realised, and particularly now anyway, people do not start protesting over nothing. That's the thing. If we think about it, there's never just, I mean, there might be the odd case, but people, they feel it's a really compelling reason. And I would say brackets, very much bracketed, if there is a very specific thing that is about someone's rights. So if we're talking about gender-based equality, if we're talking about, because for example, and also sometimes people have gatherings and marches, which I say is sort of in between the two, because it's not quite a protest, but it's about awareness. If we think about the women's march that happened, for example, that was about awareness. That wasn't a protest per se. And so again, I think, certain things can sit in the middle, but I definitely think that in certain situations, protests are necessary, because if there is something that's quite draconian being brought in, or if there's anything there that just is wrong, sometimes you need people to really have a good, solid conversation on that. But also awareness is important too, because sometimes awareness is something that's lacking, but actually sometimes the reason why people are protesting is there's been lots of awareness out there, but there's been a lot of misinformation or a lot of people diminishing that voice. So that's why, rather than actually listening to people in the first place, people had to find ways to amplify their voices and make their voices louder as things progress. So that's also something I think to bear in mind.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I'll just pick up a few of the questions we've had from some of the people that have attended. Another question, in the workplace, what inclusion initiatives, actions have you seen work well to engage the majority? That's a great question. Yeah,
that's a good one. Well, I think firstly, really firm leadership. And by firm leadership, a very clear commitment that you hear from them, but also having more and more role models actively through the organisation. That helps get things working because it shows that there's accountability. I think in some instances, having certain targets in place are important as well. But in terms of targets, very, very big caveat here. It's not just about we do this so it will drive a box ticking type of behaviour. It's just more about these are what we consider really important, and this is where we want to increase or decrease what we're doing in certain spaces that's going to be beneficial for everyone in the company. So that side of things I think is really, really important. But I think overall, just companies or leadership in companies, that means that actually there is always space and time for people. There is always space and time for people to be themselves, and the celebration of who people are and being at that company. Because I think it's not just about being productive and profitable, it's about making the place of work a place that people want to come to work as well. So that's actually, I think that cultural aspect is so crucial as well. So I think, by having those elements together, that's how you make things work, and that's how that brings out that more, and that's how it should be. And that's the organisations that really invest in their culture and take their culture seriously. They're the ones that are doing really well in this instance. And culture, it doesn't always have a KPI attached to it, but that's the most crucial area of being sustainable and being profitable and productive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that point on targets, it's about not using that as the as you say, just to tick the box, but it's about using that to measure whether progress has been made, or equally whether things are going worse or going in the wrong direction, so you can then change your course and what you're focusing on. I think that's equally really important. Another question, probably one more question I'll pick for the last couple of minutes. Whether it is LGBT, GLBT, bullying, insensitivity, mentoring, formats, minority, workplace underperformance, racism, other, they're all different issues, absolutely, which has to be dealt with as per the demographic culture also, not one size fits all. For example, India in one region, one issue could be higher than other in the USA or Europe. So I think the point here is obviously the breadth of issues around diversity and inclusion is huge, but equally then at a different country level means that we need to take very different approaches. Any thoughts or advice on that, Leng?
Yeah, well, I think it's here actually, because I definitely agree, one size never fits all with diversity and inclusion. And even within your business, you can find that certain areas of your business are totally different to each other culturally. You know, for example, your IT side might be different to your finance side, or, you know, there's all these different areas and components. But I think on a global scale, it's really crucial. So I think companies that are doing a good way of working is actually by really splitting the matrix a lot more. So you may have some overarching sort of views, you know, sort of goals or aspirations at the top in terms of how you behave, but you have to have a multi-channeled approach that's actually tailored and quite bespoke to each business area to get everyone on the same page, but also everyone at a similar stage of their journey to one another. Because I feel that, you know, we're not just one thing. We're actually quite a unique and diverse conglomerate of many things. If you think about companies, if you think about LGBT, if you think about lots of things, we're not just, and it's intersectionality based, we're not just one thing, it's many things put together. So organizations that actually take a very good sort of zonal approach, I think, are quite good, because actually they might, especially if you're a global company, because what's happening in the Americas or APAC may be so different to EMEA, for example. So it's really important that you're all talking to each other, but keeping open conversation, and also be able to share that, because it might be that something's working really well in one part of the world, but actually another part of the world, if you did exactly the same thing, that might not work so well. And in reverse, you can actually think, oh, actually this is working really well across that. So if you do have representatives in those areas, make sure you keep your collaboration going, because I think the other thing is so many organizations keep falling into siloed type ways of behaving, and that is what's going to hold you back. Be open about what's working and what isn't, because actually that's how you can keep a consistency. And I think for really good global commerce, and particularly, consistency is key. And ideally it should be a situation also from a client perspective or a customer perspective that, you know, if they work with your business or they have any interaction with your business anywhere in the world, it's a similar experience. It shouldn't be a case of one office is much better than the other and stuff, because as we know, that inconsistency can actually cost you. So building that consistency into the culture and how you work, I think, is your key to winning and being successful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Leng. It's been fantastic to have you and really enjoyed the conversation. I think in summarising some of the points that you made and really thinking about where we are now, I think recognising that, yes, progress has been made. There is definitely an increased understanding of the awareness of different issues, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think a lot of work particularly around understanding the root causes of issues, and without having that understanding of those root causes, how are you able to focus on the right things and the things that have the biggest impact? And the other thing for me is making sure that the work around diversity, inclusion and equality is focused on the whole employee life cycle. I think I definitely agree. A lot of work has been done around the talent attraction again, it's not perfect, but there are things that have definitely improved that, and many corporations have taken a really progressive approach in that area. But I think that there's much more to do once employees are in the business and managing the talent management process, performance, development. And as you say, it's not just about looking at things such as the ethnicity or gender pay gap, it's looking at the broader things around compensation, benefits, and decisions on all of those areas. So thank you again for your time.